Hi everyone, I'm Julian, your Biology 2600 lab instructor. This week we're going to be doing Lab 5, Population Ecology, which is a computer lab using R code. This week I'm going to post two videos. In this one I'm going to discuss the background to this lab. Make sure you take a look at Dr. Leroux's Week 6 lecture, as it provides a lot of this background in detail. Second video that I post is where I show you how to actually run through the code and hopefully address most of your concerns. As I remember the last time you guys did our code, a lot of people weren't happy. This week promises to be easier, hopefully. So the purpose of this lab is to provide an overview of different types of population growth and how they can be modeled. So we're going to jump right in and begin with some definitions. So population, which I abbreviate as POPN, is a group of individuals of the same species living in a specific area at the same time. Population ecology is the study of how populations, which can be of plants, animals, or other organisms, change over time and space, and how they interact with their environment. Population growth is how the size of the population changes over time. One thing I will point out is that populations can either increase, this is known as positive growth, or they can decrease, and this is known as negative growth. So as a result of four continuously changing factors, the size of populations will continuously change. So this is referred to as the BIDE model. BIDE is an acronym which is composed of the first letter of each of these words here: birth, immigration, death, and immigration. So your population size is going to be based on all four of these processes. I'm just going to rearrange this. So I just took immigration and put it over here, and I took death and put it over here. And I'm rearranging it for the purpose of this talk because we're going to begin by focusing on birth and death, and we're going to come back to immigration and immigration a little bit later. So in terms of death, the death occurs at variable times, generally speaking. So I'm not really going to say a lot about that, but I will mention birth. So birth occurs at specific times of the year, and this depends on the organism. So some organisms reproduce at discrete times of the year, other ones reproduce continuously throughout the year. If an organism reproduces at discrete times, we're going to use the geometric population growth model. And if it reproduces continuously, we're going to use the exponential population growth model. So for geometric population growth, the birth will occur at discrete times of the year. And the reason for this is that reproduction, which is dependent on the breeding season, is limited to specific periods during the year. So in some cases, for certain organisms like foxes and wolves and plants, there's only one breeding season during the year, which will result in production of a certain number of offspring. And another example would be where there's a few breeding seasons, a few discrete breeding seasons, which produce a number of offspring. Some examples of this would include horses, sheep, etc. The idea for both of these, though, is that if you have one or even a number of breeding seasons during the year, they are discrete and they will produce one generation for this entire year, and this generation will not overlap with the generation produced the previous year or the next year. And so this is referred to as non-overlapping generations. The geometric population growth model states that if there are no restrictions, so unlimited resources, successive generations will differ in size, so they will grow geometrically by a constant ratio. So this is the same factor, and this is different from the same number. So I'm going to show you that now. So I'm just going to bring up the idea of linear growth. This is not something that you're responsible for, but it just makes understanding geometric growth a little bit easier. So in linear growth, you have an increase in population by the exact same number. So if you look here, the increase per year is 10, and this is constant. The graph that is produced by this is a completely linear line, which is why it's called the linear growth model. So this is different from geometric growth, which increases by the same factor and not number. So in this case, the factor is 1.4, and I picked this randomly. But what you can see is that if you have the same factor as opposed to the same number, your population grows by an ever increasing amount every year. And so when you look at the graph, you end up getting a slightly curved line. So initially, when there's few organisms, you're going to get slow growth. And as you add more and more organisms, the population will grow faster and faster. So the model that we use to describe geometric population growth is as follows. Lambda equals nt plus 1 over nt, where lambda is your growth rate, or the factor by which the population increases every year. Nt is the size of your initial population, or your population at your initial breeding season. Nt plus 1 is your population size at the following or subsequent breeding season. So I'll just show you what this formula looks like in our code. This is it here. You'll see that in our script. This figure is from your textbook, and it was shown in Dr. Leroux's presentation. So I just wanted to bring it up to show you that time is down here on an axis. So earlier time is t, later times t plus 1, initial population is t, later population is then t plus 1, and the slope here is the growth rate. So you'll notice that this line looks linear, and I mentioned that the geometric growth rate produces a slightly curved line. So the reason this is linear is because it is between two discrete time points. So if you look at the line between each of these points, you will see that it's linear, but because it increases over time, it ends up curving. So one of the problems with this geometric population growth model is that you can only calculate the growth rate between one population and the subsequent or next or adjacent population, and that's not really useful. So in Dr. Leroux's lecture, he shows you how you can take this and develop it further to give you this equation, which is much more useful. So first off, this is what this formula would look like in our script. And so in terms of the variables, N0 is going to be pretty much the same as NT over here. It's your population size at an initial time or your initial breeding season. NT ends up being slightly different. So NT is not the next season. It could actually be any future breeding season or some future point in time. Lambda is the same. It's your growth rate. And T is the number of time intervals or breeding seasons in between. So now you can calculate the growth rate over a number of different generations. And I'll point this out now, keep in mind that for all of these formulas, you can rearrange them to solve for any of the variables. And that's going to be useful for your R script. So by developing this formula for geometric growth, we now have a much more useful way of calculating population growth and size changes over non-sequential breeding seasons. So next we're going to jump to exponential population growth. As mentioned, birth occurs continuously throughout the year, and this is because reproduction or breeding seasons occur continuously throughout the year. So this ends up looking something like this. So each of these peaks is where offspring are produced. And so if you kind of picture the next year or the previous year, if you have offspring or generations being produced at each of these peaks, it's going to be very hard to separate the generations from this year with the generations from next year. And that's why this type of growth is described as having overlapping generations, which results in continuous growth. And so if there are no restrictions, unlimited resources, this type of population growth will grow exponentially and produce a J-shaped curve. And again, it's going to grow by a constant factor. So I've already shown linear growth, which increases by a constant number and produces a linear line. And we've discussed geometric growth, which increases by a constant factor, and so the line ends up curving. Exponential growth is going to be very similar to geometric. So your line has a curve, it grows by, because it grows by a constant factor. So the difference here is that the constant factor is just larger. For geometric growth, the factor was 1.4. Here we're using something higher, 2. So you can see that these numbers here increase much faster, and this causes the line to increase much faster. But the idea is the same, it's just faster because exponential has continuous breeding seasons, whereas these are less or fewer and because they're discrete. So it starts off slow. As your population increases, the growth rate by which it grows also increases. So your exponential population growth model looks like this. This is a differential equation which shows the change in population size over continuous time, and that equals your intrinsic rate of increase multiplied by your initial population size. So differential equation, you do some fancy calculus, which I have no idea about, but you can ask Dr. Leroux if you're interested, and you get this equation right here, where N0 is your initial population size, and T is your population size at some future point. E is the base of your natural logarithm. R is your intrinsic rate of increase, and T is the time interval that you're looking at. I will mention that R, your rate of increase for exponential growth, can be related to lambda, which is your growth rate for geometric growth, by this equation here. And this will be useful in your lab this week. Speaking of your lab, this is what this equation will look like in your R script. And also in R, this equation will look like this. So I want to do a brief comparison between lambda and R and point out some general trends. So lambda is your geometric rate of increase for populations that reproduce at discrete time points. R is your per capita rate of increase for populations that reproduce continuously. These variables can be related by this equation. R equals the natural log of lambda. So when you have a lambda value of 1, or you have an R value of 0, your population is not growing over time, and graphically it will look like this. When you have a lambda that is greater than 1, so any value greater than 1, or an R which is greater than 0, so in this case a positive value, you will have a population which grows, and this looks like this. When lambda is less than 1, or R is less than 0, so in this case R would be negative, you would have a decreasing population, and that will look like this. So given these values, you now know what the graphs will look like, but you can also work backwards. Given these graphs, you can have a general idea of what these values will be like. So In terms, another trend that we can look at is in terms of the slope. So let's go back. So if we look at this graph, we have two different slopes. As I mentioned, the slope is the actual value of lambda or r. So the steeper the slope, so as in C here, the higher the r or the lambda value will be, which means the population is growing faster. And so the opposite is also true. If you have a more gradual slope, your population is growing slower and your lambda or r value will be lower. So given this graph, you can actually have a general idea of your R or lambda values as well. Next, we're going to jump into logistic population growth. So far we've been looking at populations that grow without any limited resources. But in reality, this can't be the case. There's no matter the situation, there's always going to be limited resources at some point in time, or once the population gets to a certain size. So the way we model populations that grow with limited resources is by using logistic population growth. And this is very similar to exponential growth, so the population grows exponentially until it reaches a carrying capacity. Carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals that the environment can sustain or support. And so this is constrained by resources. And once K is reached, the growth pattern is going to end up being sigmoidal. So what that means is it fluctuates or oscillates above and below the carrying capacity with no net increase. So showing this graph and this data for exponential growth, for logistic growth. So the initial populations here are a little bit different, but the idea is still the same. For exponential, you double your population size every time. Here, you begin that way, so you start doubling your population up till the point that you get to about 160, and then it doesn't double, and then it decreases, increases slightly, and decreases. So what has happened is at about 160, the population has reached its carrying capacity, K, and it begins to fluctuate above and below, but it doesn't have a net increase. So this is the model for logistic population growth. It can be rearranged slightly to produce this if you prefer. I mentioned that this model is very similar to the exponential growth model. So this was the formula for that, and you can see that they're very similar. The only difference is that the logistic one has the carrying capacity variable. So this formula states that the change in population size over time equals the maximum per capita growth rate multiplied by the population size multiplied by the carrying capacity. So one of the trends that you get is that as your population size n increases, or in other words, gets closer to k, your per capita growth rate is going to decrease. So if you think about this logically, as n gets closer to here, it is going to slow down in terms of growth rate once it hits k, because it can't grow past that. And then you're going to get fluctuation but no net increase, which means your dn over dt will be 0. And so if you look at the equation, it also makes sense in terms of the equation. So if n gets close to k, so let's just say n is 1, or say n is 160, and your k is 160, 160 over 160 is going to be 1. 1 minus 1 is 0. Because you multiply it by these, this whole side of the equation is going to be 0, which means your rate is 0. So the carrying capacity acts as a moderating force, in the growth rate by reducing population growth when resources become limited, which is what makes it a practical model. And eventually it stops net growth once K has been reached. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about population regulation now. So the idea of population regulation is that populations are regulated or kept in check by external factors. So these can be broken into two categories, density dependent and density independent. Um, Before I get to those, I'll just mention that density is going to be proportional to size. So as your population size increases, density will also increase. Density dependent factors tend to be biotic or living, and density independent factors tend to be abiotic or non-living, so chemical or physical. So in terms of density dependent factors, the effect of these is going to depend on population density. So what we see is you're going to have your population starting off low, it's going to grow exponentially, and then once it gets to a certain size, or once it gets to a certain density, you're going to have several limiting resources. So the most obvious are going to be food for animals, light for plants, space where they live, space for shelter during harsh environmental conditions. Because population size is going to be so large, it's going to be easier for predators to attack and to kill off organisms. And something that's particularly relevant these days, disease, the whole idea of social distancing. Once you get to a large population and you increase your density, it makes it very easy for disease to spread. Also, a lot more organisms, a lot more dense are going to be producing a lot more waste, so this needs to go somewhere. So you can contaminate your environment, your food source, or the waste can actually help the spread of disease. So all of these factors depend on the size or density of the population. Density independent factors, on the other hand, don't depend on density. So populations can be regulated by things like natural disasters, lightning, hurricanes, etc. And this is not going to depend on density. So if there is a forest fire somewhere and there's happens to be two moose, um, both of those moose may be killed. If there is 100 moose, they may be killed. If there's 160 moose, they're going to be killed. So it has it has nothing to do with the density, but it is a method of population regulation. All of the growth population models that we've looked at so far assume that there is a single or isolated population, but of course this isn't the case in reality, where species are spread over large areas and they are in smaller subpopulations which operate at some level. And this is where the idea of metapopulations comes in. So metapopulation is a collection of spatially distinct but interconnected subpopulations, and these are referred to as patches. A patch is a distinct area of habitat for a specific organism. And so I'm going to use the example of the human population just because it's accurate and easily relatable. So the map of Newfoundland here represents the entire area where the metapopulation exists. The orange circles are the inhabited patches. The gray circle over here is the uninhabited patch. So this area contains food, it contains a suitable environment, everything that can sustain organisms, except that there just isn't any organisms living there at the current time. And the last thing I will mention is that the patch occupancy is so the number of organisms in each of these subpopulations or patches is represented by the size of the circle. So this patch has a largest number of organisms, this patch and this patch would have the lowest number of organisms. So far, our discussion on population size has been primarily based on birth and death. Now that we're dealing with metapopulations, we're going to bring in the migration aspect. So we're going to start at the local scale. What that means is the population size at an individual patch within this metapopulation. So we're going to refer to the bi-model, which I mentioned at the beginning. So your size of your population in a specific patch is equal to the birth and death and immigration of individuals. So if we look at this diagram, now we can add arrows, and these arrows represent possible migration between inhabited patches. So individuals in these inhabited patches can move between each of the patches. So the next level that we're going to look at is the regional scale, and this examines the entire metapopulation. So all of the patches simultaneously. So we have birth and death as aspects. We just brought in immigration and immigration, and now we're going to bring in two more aspects. And these, the first one of these is colonization. So colonization is the dispersal of individuals from their birthplace to another uninhabited area or an uninhabited patch. So again, this is a suitable environment. There just hasn't been organisms. So through dispersal, the organisms move here and they successfully establish a population. So now this population is, or this patch is inhabited. And the last aspect is extinction. So we think of extinction as for an entire species, but ecologically speaking, it can be for an entire species, but it can also be for specific subpopulations, or in this case, specific patches. So let's say there is some sort of disease here, and it ends up eliminating all the organisms. So this patch no longer has any organisms and they're extinct. So because you have migration, so you have a patch right here which is pretty close, and the organisms in it can migrate, and because this habitat is still intact, it wasn't, say, destroyed by a fire, you can actually have recolonization of this extinct patch. So it went extinct, but because of migration, it was recolonized. So one of the levels you can kind of see on the local scale, but definitely more on this scale, is the idea that or the approach that we're shifting now from population size to more of population persistence. So it's not just the number of individuals, it's does this population exist in this area during a specific time. And so this idea is reflected in the metapopulation model, which is referred to as the patch occupancy rate. So we're not talking about size anymore. So if we look a little bit closer, P is your patch occupancy, proportion of patches that are occupied by organisms. You guys are going to have to calculate this for one of your questions on your assignment. It's just the number of occupied patches divided by the total number of patches. C, little c, is your colonization rate for a specific patch, and E is your extinction rate for a specific patch. So if we look, before I get to that, so this model can be described as the change in patch occupancy over time. So if we look a little bit closer at this chunk right here, which is specific patch colonization rate multiplied by occupied patches multiplied by unoccupied patches, this gives you the overall colonization rate for the entire metapopulation. And the same thing applies for the extinction. So the extinction rate for a specific patch multiplied by the number of occupied patches or proportion of occupied patches gives you the overall extinction rate for the metapopulation. So now if we go back and summarize the model, change in patch occupancy rate over time equals the overall colonization rate for the metapopulation minus the overall extinction rate for the metapopulation. So if you look a little bit further at overall colonization and extinction, so some of the trends that you'll see. So if your patch occupancy is low, you're going to have very few patches that are occupied, so very few individuals that can colonize other patches. So your colonization is low. On the other end of the spectrum, if your patch occupancy is really high, there are going to be very few patches left to be colonized. So again, your colonization rate will be low. The sweet spot is going to be somewhere in the middle, where you have a decent number of patches that are occupied and a decent number of patches that are left to be occupied, giving you the highest possible colonization rate. In terms of extinction, patch occupancy is going to be proportional to the extinction. So if you have very few patches that are occupied, you're going to have a low extinction rate, and as you increase, so as all your patches are occupied, you're going to increase the chances that one of those patches can become extinct. So when you combine two of these graphs, you get an idea of equilibrium patch occupancy. So where is the sweet spot in between these? And so essentially you're going to balance your colonization rate with your extinction rate. And if you work this formula, you end up getting something like this. So some of the trends that you can see from this, if E is greater than 0, which it always is, you're going to have some possibility of empty patches or extinct patches. If E is greater than C, that would mean that this number here is bigger, and so your population, so when it's subtracted from 1, your population will be 0 and it will go extinct. If C is greater than E, that means you have a lot of colonization, you have very little extinction. When you go 1 minus what would be a very small number, you'd have a high patch occupancy, so your population will persist. So for the last slide, I'm going to go through some assumptions or interpretations of metapopulations. So the first thing is that all patches, will eventually go extinct, and there's a number of reasons for this. The food runs out, there's some sort of catastrophic events, inbreeding depression, etc. Smaller patches will go extinct faster, fewer individuals. Migration will lower the probability that patches go extinct. So this is known as the rescue effect. So due to migration, you're getting an influx of individuals to a patch, so it prevents the population from dying out. Closer patches are going to take longer to go extinct, so closer patches are going to have a higher migration rate. It's just easier to go from one patch to another patch if it's closer. And small patches, even though you have small patches, if you have a high migration rate, it can be prevented from going extinct. If the patches happen to go extinct, migration can recolonize those patches, assuming that the habitat hasn't been completely destroyed. And so the overall thing that you want to take home for metapopulations is that while single populations can't guarantee the survival of species, the combined effect of many subpopulations or many patches can, or potentially can, guarantee the survival of the species.